All right, thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here to tell you a little bit about our effort to obtain IPD. In this context, it was a team effort. I'd like to acknowledge all of my collaborators listed here, and this was a part of the COVID NMA initiative. So just by way of background, obtaining IPD during the pandemic was particularly important given the context. Evidence was evolving rapidly, and clinicians and policymakers and other decision makers had to make rapid decisions in the context of significant uncertainty about what treatments would work for whom, with often limited evidence and sometimes biased results. And in this context, IPD could help, obviously, by helping investigate potential bias, contributing to meta-analyses to help explore the hypotheses regarding factors associated with treatment response, and overall improving the validity and reproducibility of research. And there was a survey that was conducted in 2021 that actually suggested that data sharing intentions during the pandemic had actually increased. Of 280 studies that were surveyed, approximately 57% had actually declared a positive willingness to share IPD. So that gave reason to think that researchers would be making their data more accessible during this public health emergency. So essentially, that's what we tried to do. We tried to obtain IPD from these trialists, specifically for the purpose of conducting an IPD meta-analysis for the COVID NMA initiative. Here are our methods. We emailed corresponding authors of eligible RCTs. These trials were either released through preprint or peer review between the dates of March 2020 and May 2021. And we identified these studies through weekly searches on the LOVE platform and the Cochrane COVID-19 study register. We emailed authors once with 2 reminders, regardless of what their data sharing statements said. And these emails were sent between the dates of November 2020 to September 2021. Alongside this, we also searched online data repositories, including Vivli, Yoda, and CSDR. We also collaborated with Vivli, who offered free services for studies on COVID-19, specifically free hosting of data and also free anonymization services. Other incentives that we provided to share IPD, co-authorship on studies using their IPD. And we also highlighted that the effort is part of an international Cochrane initiative commissioned by the World Health Organization. Our outcome was the proportion of studies for which we could access IPD, which we defined as a data set obtained directly from trialists or those that were made accessible online. So here's a little bit about our sample. We included 229 studies in our sample. And of these, about 60% were peer-reviewed publications at the time of our initial outreach. 40% were preprints. 65% of these studies took place in low to middle income countries. Just under a third in high income countries, and the rest in countries that span all the income levels. More than half were multi-center studies and the rest were single center studies. And here are our results. In terms of email responses, we heard back from 50% of folks that we reached out to. But in terms of IPD accessibility, we were able to access 24% of the data that we requested. And just breaking that down, 11% we received directly, so bilaterally from investigators. 7% was made available through Vivli, and the remaining 6% through other online repositories. 55% of those who shared came from low to middle income countries, 34% from high income countries, and then 11% mixed. And this figure demonstrates data sharing intentions and accessibility over time. So just to walk you through this a little bit. On the left-hand side, you have data sharing intentions as declared in the registry. In the middle, you have data sharing intentions as stated in the preprint or publication. And on the far right, you have actual IPD accessibility. Everything in green is good, red is bad, yellow is not reported, and blue is undecided. So 2 points I'd like to make about this figure. First of all, you see that data sharing intentions grew, moving from the registry to the preprint and publication. And the second obvious takeaway is that when it comes to actual IPD accessibility, there's a huge drop off. Of 142 studies that stated at the preprint or publication stage that they would share their data, we could only access about a third of it. When you look at this by study country, you also see quite a bit of variability. So here I've listed the top 10 countries where most of the studies took place, and they're ordered in the decreasing number of studies per country. So a few notable things, you see that China and Russia, we were not able to access any of those studies that took place in those countries. While Argentina, of the 7 studies that took place there, they shared over half of their studies. Brazil, of the 21 studies that took place there, they shared over 1/3. And at the United studies that took place in the United States, we were able to access around 1/5 of the data. And here you see IPD accessibility broken down by funding source. So along the x-axis, you have the funding source categorized by private, public or nonprofit, mixed funding sources, no funding at all, and then not reported. And pay attention to the blue chunks, because that means that that we were able to access the data. So what you have here is privately funded studies shared their data at about, at about 1/5 of their studies. Public nonprofit, a little less at 14%. Studies that had mixed funding, so for example, public funding with a drug donation, or, as well as those who received no funding, shared at about 40%. I should actually say we were able to access IPD at the rate of 40% for those studies. So just a few limitations about our work. First of all, the timing of our contact could have been too early, as investigators were dealing with the pandemic. They're busy, overwhelmed, and focused on their clinical trials, not necessarily sharing the data. Also, only the corresponding authors were contacted. We did use contact information in the registry and in the publication, but we didn't have the time or the resources of the staff to go any further than that. And finally, we can't exclude that the authors did not receive our request, and we did not request a read receipt on our email, so this is always a possibility. So just to conclude, despite the increase in positive data sharing sentiment during the pandemic, we were still only able to access about 1/4 of the data. And IPD was inaccessible for the majority of studies with positive data sharing declarations. My final bullet is a conclusion that I think you've heard throughout the panel, but also throughout the conference, which is obviously we need to do more to address what seems to be really structural issues in terms of IPD data sharing. Thank you very much.
Laura, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Given the implications of this kind of research and its importance to public health, it is very serious, and it's very disconcerting to see the lack of available data. But I wonder if approaching the named investigator is the right way to try to get data if you don't hear a response. And in efforts to get information that would be of interest to public health, contacting institution, contacting the relevant ministry in the country of concern would be a good way to go about gathering this data if it was needed for some purpose. So I'm wondering in the future, beyond just contacting the investigator, what other things people can do.
That's a great point. And two things. So at the beginning of our work, I mean, we did discuss how far we could go in terms of trying to follow up with investigators and contact them. The reality was that everybody was extremely overwhelmed and busy during this public health emergency. And I think our study essentially illustrates that it's a fundamentally dysfunctional system to expect to be relying on email contact and replies to email in order to access data in a public health emergency.
Thank you.
Hi, Benjamin Speicher, University Hospital Basel, Switzerland. Thank you very much for this great talk and this study. We are currently conducting an individual patient data meta-analysis on a COVID treatment, and we're experiencing exactly what you're telling. So we identified 8 trials, and 6 out of the 8 we received already, and with 2 we are in contact, but we're really struggling getting this data, despite their clearly stating in the journal that they share this data openly. So my question is a bit similar. So what would you recommend? I mean, would you recommend to get in contact with the journal? So what to do next? And you also mentioned the timing. So I think my question is also what timing is acceptable after the publication to share or receive the data? I mean, because we feel like we should get our study along and publish it, but we're still waiting for 2 trials.
Great questions. I mean, in terms of timing, you know, I guess the question is really back on you. How long are you willing to wait to run this analysis? I do think that there's literature out there that that my colleagues on the panel might be able to speak more accurately on this in terms of how long is reasonable to wait for this data? Is it 6 months after publication? Are there special circumstances in case of a public health emergency? In terms of how to actually get this data, I mean, if you're waiting for 2 more studies, I mean, you have the resources and to be able to follow up by phone call, etc. But I don't have any magic bullets to offer.
But would you recommend, like, is it a strategy also to get in contact or with the journals? Would that be some? Because for me, it's a bit troubling that they clearly state in the journal that this data is available. But I mean, as you have shown, many do that. But isn't that strange? I mean, it seems to me it's like an exercise that they say this, but it doesn't mean anything really.
I don't have an answer to your question.
Thank you. And there were we thinking you had all the magic bullets. Okay, listen, there are a lot of questions. So what I'm going to ask, I want to get through them, but please keep it short. John.
Amazing work and very timely, of course. Even before the pandemic, John Carlisle, one of the editors of Anesthesia, coined the term zombie trials because he was trying to get the raw data from trials coming to his journal. And he realized that about 30 to 40% of them were either fraudulent or were such a huge mess that, you know, could only call them zombies. I was wondering whether for the COVID literature, we have the same. I saw the countries where these studies are coming from. They're the high risk countries that had the highest rates in John Carlisle's experience, like, you know, more than 40% being zombies. So the fact that someone doesn't want to share, could that mean that that's not a trial, or is a fraudulent trial or a fraudulent entry? And those who did share, did you go to see if their data were like basically congruent with themselves?
Excellent points. We need to go back into the data and see if there are zombie trials in there. I mean, we didn't have the resources at the time to actually go and look to see the number that were fraudulent. I mean, we do have a system as part of the COVID NMA to, you know, we use Retraction Watch to pull studies that, you know, were retracted. But I think aside from that, I would defer to Isabel for more details on that. But the second point, we checked the usability of the data in a cursory way through our statistician, but we're continuing to do work to really determine the quality of the data that we actually obtained.
Okay, right, I'm going to try and speed this up. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to go there, 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 online, then back there, and that's it. Okay, over to you.
Yeah, Mark Helfand, Portland, Oregon. You said twice, people were busy, COVID, and I want to underline that distinction between the intentions and what you could actually get done. We completed a randomized trial. We analyzed the data just before the pandemic, got it onto clinicaltrials.gov, had a great conversation with people who wanted to get the data set. And then things exploded. The statistician was unable to continue to work. We'd clean the data set, but I don't want to go on and on. Then we said, well, what if we have funding to do this? We got the funding. We still couldn't get a team together. So there are real logistical hassles, even when the intentions are, very good. And in fact, we would have loved to be able to get this data set to the people who wanted it. They were trying to plan bigger trials, and it was really a pretty critical component of that. So I would just say, I think you're right. It's not just busy, but it's just logistically trying to do this in this era was very hard.
Great point. I just want to add that we've used the term IPD accessibility intentionally, as opposed to these people did not share their data, because it's a structural issue.
Okay,
So just a comment really, Valda Vincent from Science. I mean, this is why we've moved to requiring data to be deposited in repositories so that you're not reliant on the author. And second to that, we would take it really seriously if we have a data statement that says the data is available and is available here, and someone reaches out to us and says that's not true, we take that very, very seriously, and we'll put serious pressure on to get the data. So, if it's at our journal, let us know. We'll put pressure on.
great. Thank you.
Thank you, Bennett Holman, Yonsei University. It seems like a lot of the problems here is that you're asking busy people to do something else to get your data. And that's really about kind of the architecture of things. So, in some senses is like an opt-in, right? You're asking for the data and then they have to do something to get it to you. Is there any reason that you can see why it wouldn't be more effective or efficient to have an opt-out? So you make a request, then there's like a 1 month time frame, and if they don't respond, then automatically you get the data because it's on some sort of repository or something like that. Would that be a feasible and perhaps more efficient system in your mind?
I mean, that sounds like a really interesting idea. And it does sound like the new models that are being discussed at this conference and elsewhere really, talk about, trying to bake this in the front end, having a data sharing plan, having resources, knowing that you are going to put your data somewhere and that maybe there is this opt-out clause.
Thanks.
Similarly, Ana Catarina Pinho Gomez proposes offering PIs the possibility of being co-authors of a meta-analysis from IPD. Wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, that was one of the incentives that we offered to folks we reached out to.
Personal interest works every time. Okay.
Ben Mol, Monash University, Melbourne. I'm an OBGYN, so my core business is women's health, but for the Saturday night, I do crosswords on data from COVID trials, and I've assessed 5 papers from Abdel Salam from Egypt, the original data. They're all fabricated.
Mhm.
So I'm curious what you have found, and to also put that elephant in the room, he is co-author of work of John Heer and David Moher in a meta-analysis, and until now, no action has been taken by any of the authors from that meta-analysis with the data of Abdel Salam in it. They're not going to change the outcome, but I think we should have zero tolerance to every fabricated paper, and it is also not happening in this room.
Okay.
I mean, I think the issue of fabricated, plagiarized, fake papers is something that has been really highlighted at this conference, and rightly so. And looking forward to digging into that in our own work.
Okay, thank you. A question from me. I mean, it seems to me the only way we're going to change things is if we ask, a bit like, a colleague from Science said, if we ask for mandatory deposition of data, is that an impossible dream?
I don't think so. I mean, look at what the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute is already doing with its large trials. They require data sharing. And there's a data sharing plan, there's resources, there's a place to put it. The onus is on funders, I mean, it's the system. So I think it's
Great.
doable.
And in the meantime, the response is on all of us to require data sharing and to implement it. So listen, thank you very much.
Thank you.